St. Patrick's Day, a day where everyone is Irish. Green beer, leprechauns, corned beef and cabbage dinners, parades and celebrations. But what if I told you that St. Patrick's Day, at least as we know it today, is largely a modern invention? And what if I told you something even stranger? That the modern version of St. Patrick's Day didn't begin in Ireland at all. It began in America. And if that wasn't surprising enough, St. Patrick himself wasn't even Irish. If any of those facts sound astonishing, then you're in for a treat because the real story of St. Patrick is far more fascinating than shamrocks and green beer. In fact, I would argue that the life of St. Patrick is one of the most remarkable stories in Western history. And according to some historians, St. Patrick may have even helped save Western civilization itself. To understand the holiday we celebrate today, we actually have to start in 18th century colonial America. The Charitable Irish Society organized the first St. Patrick's Day parade in 1737 in South Boston, yet these early celebrations were relatively small and not widely participated in by the general public. It wasn't until 100 years later that St. Patrick's Day began to transform into the massive cultural event we recognize today. After the Great Famine in Ireland during the 1840s, millions of Irish immigrants fled their homeland and arrived in cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Life for these immigrants was extremely difficult. They faced harsh discrimination from native born Americans, who often viewed them as poor, uneducated, and culturally alien. The Irish were often met with suspicion for their Catholic faith because native born Americans felt that their loyalties lied with the Pope and not America. Irish immigrants were mocked, excluded from jobs, and sometimes openly despised. But the Irish are also a notoriously proud people, and in response to this discrimination, Irish American communities increasingly began to publicly celebrate their identity. One of the most powerful symbols of that identity was the Catholic feast day of St. Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland. What had originally been a relatively modest religious feast day became something much larger. Adopting earlier public celebrations, as witnessed in colonial Boston, Irish immigrants across America began organizing parades, public festivals, and celebrations honoring St. Patrick. Over time, these celebrations grew, and eventually they were embraced not just by Irish immigrants, but by Americans more broadly. By the early 20th century, St. Patrick's Day had transformed into a nationwide celebration. And in a fascinating twist of history, this American style celebration was eventually exported back to Ireland, where it was embraced and promoted globally. The result is the St. Patrick's Day we recognize today, a secular yet cultural festival celebrated all over the world. But in the process, something significant happened. The real story of St. Patrick, the man behind the holiday, was largely forgotten. And that's unfortunate because his story is truly extraordinary. The story begins roughly 1600 years ago in Roman Britain. Patrick was born sometime in the late 4th century into a relatively well off Romano British family. His father was a decurion, or a local civic official within the Roman administration, and also served as a deacon in the local church. Patrick grew up in a Romanized world with Roman law, Roman culture, and Roman education, and this was the civilization he had belonged to. But when Patrick was 16 years old, his life had changed forever. Irish pirates attacked the coast of Britain. Patrick was captured, shipped across the Irish Sea, and sold into slavery in Ireland. As a slave, he worked as a shepherd, often isolated and alone, living outdoors for months at a time. He endured the bitter cold, hunger, loneliness, and uncertainty. Up until this point in his life, Patrick admits that he had been largely indifferent toward religion, but the conditions of his slavery had changed him. In the loneliness of the Irish countryside, Patrick began to consistently pray. Years later, he describes this experience in his own writing known as the Confession. He writes, "I used to pray many times a day. More and more did the love of God and my fear of Him and faith increase. I would wake up before daylight to pray in the snow, in icy coldness and rain, and I felt no ill effects nor any slothfulness, because as I now see, the Spirit was burning inside of me." For 6 years, Patrick lived this way, when suddenly he had a dream. In the dream, he heard a voice telling him that it was time to escape. Patrick writes, "And there indeed one night in my sleep I heard a voice saying to me, 'You fast well, you will soon go to your own country.' And again I heard a voice prophesying to me, 'Behold, your ship is ready.'" The ship, however, was not nearby. It was over 200 miles away across unfamiliar territory. Patrick explains that he ran from his master and began the long journey across Ireland, somehow managing to reach the coast and incredibly finding passage on a ship that eventually carried him back to Britain. After 6 years of slavery, Patrick was finally home. But this is where the story takes an even more unexpected turn. Returning home should have been the end of the story, but for Patrick it was only the beginning. His years in Ireland had drastically changed him. He no longer fits in with Roman culture. Compared to his peers, he is dramatically unsophisticated after missing out on the Roman education common among his social class. To Patrick, Britain no longer feels like home. Then one night he has another dream, a vision often referred to by scholars as the voice of the Irish. Patrick describes it in this way: "And there I saw in a vision of the night a man coming, as it were, from Ireland, whose name was Victoricus, bringing innumerable letters, and he gave me one of them. And I read the beginning of the letter, which was entitled The Voice of the Irish. And while I was reading the beginning of the letter, I thought at that very moment I heard the voice of those who were beside the wood of Foclit, which is near the western sea, and they cried out as with one voice, 'We beg you, holy boy, to come out and walk again among us.' And I was greatly pierced in heart, and could read no more." He believed in these visions that he was being called to return to Ireland, not as a slave this time, but as a missionary. Patrick quickly began years of religious training. He was ordained first as a deacon, later as a priest, and eventually sent as a missionary bishop to Ireland. Just think about how extraordinary this decision was. Patrick returned voluntarily to the land where he had been enslaved. He returned to preach the gospel to the very people who had once held him captive. And against all odds, his mission was wildly successful. Patrick traveled throughout Ireland preaching, baptizing, establishing churches, and ordaining clergy. In his writings, he reflects on this mission with amazement. "For behold, we are witnesses that the gospel has been preached as far as where no one else has gone beyond, and there in Ireland I baptized innumerable peoples." Over time, Christianity spread rapidly across Ireland. Patrick became remembered not just as a missionary, but what is now known as the Apostle of Ireland. In subsequent centuries, incredible tales would emerge throughout Ireland regarding the life of St. Patrick. Some of these stories are legendary. One famous legend claims that St. Patrick had banished all the snakes from Ireland, driving them into the sea after he had fasted for 40 days. Another tells of dramatic confrontations and battles with pagan druids. The shamrock, according to tradition, became associated with Patrick because he supposedly used it to explain the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. Other legends claim that enemies who attempted to kill him were miraculously turned to stone right before their sword had struck Patrick. Whether these stories are literal history or later folklore is difficult to say, but they reflect something more important. Patrick became a towering figure in Irish memory and culture. Eventually, the medieval church established March 17th, the date traditionally associated with his death, as his official feast day. Yet again, the story does not end here, but the most remarkable part of Patrick's story may actually come after his death. In the late 5th century, the Western Roman Empire had collapsed. For centuries, Rome had held together much of Europe through its political institutions, its military power, and its vast network of cities and trade routes. But when Rome fell, everything had changed. Much of that structure collapsed with it. Urban life declined, education crumbled, and libraries were destroyed. Many of the classical texts of Greece and Rome, such as the works of Aristotle, Virgil, Cicero, and others, began to rapidly disappear. But there was one place on the edge of Europe that experienced something very different: Ireland. Ireland had never been conquered by Rome, and by the time Rome collapsed, Ireland had become a vibrant center of Christian monastic culture. The Irish monasteries became centers of learning, scholarship, and literacy. Monks copied manuscripts by hand, preserving both Christian writings and the classical works of ancient Greece and Rome. Historian Thomas Cahill famously argued that these Irish monks played a crucial role in preserving Western intellectual tradition. He writes, "Without the mission of the Irish monks, the world that came after them would have been an entirely different one, a world without books." From the 6th century onward, Irish monks began traveling across Europe as missionaries. They established monasteries in places like France, Switzerland, Germany, and Italy. These monasteries became centers of learning during a time when much of Europe was struggling through instability and cultural decline. They preserved text, they taught literacy, and they helped rebuild intellectual life in post Roman Europe. According to Cahill's interpretation, this entire monastic movement can be ultimately traced back to one catalytic moment, the conversion of Ireland that began with St. Patrick. When we celebrate St. Patrick's Day, it's worth remembering that the real story behind the holiday is far deeper and meaningful than green beer and parades. It's the story of how a kidnapped teenager who endured slavery became a man who returned to the land of his captivity to share his faith, and how his legacy helped preserve the intellectual foundations of Western civilization during one of its darkest periods. So the next time someone hands you a green beer on March 17th, make sure you raise a toast to St. Patrick, the man whose story helped shape the course of Western civilization.